Hi and welcome to the Let's Talk podcast. And today I have Tony with me and we're going to be talking about fear and how that interferes with our life, our health and our development. And this is going to be a conversation-based podcast. If you're not already subscribed, then make sure you subscribe. And here we talk about spirituality, healing, self-development and topics of interest that will help to expand your mind and offer a different perspective. So, hello, Tony. Nice to have you on the podcast.
Hello, Natalie, and welcome to my home. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
No, it's an honour to be invited to do my first podcast, even though I've done many presentations in the past of various descriptions. This is my first cast.
Oh my goodness.
So, yeah, it's kind of like, ooh, I've been invited to do a podcast, amazing.
It's because we have such great conversations as well, and your viewpoints are, you've got amazing viewpoints, and I think that bringing them on for the people to hear about, to see, would be brilliant.
Yeah, I think everybody has something to share, don't they?
Yeah.
It's how we can, I think sometimes it's up to the listener to take responsibility to what they take from a conversation. Some people might see a podcast or listen to somebody talking and say, well, there's nothing in there for me. And actually that's not the person who's giving the speech or talking about something. It's actually the listener's responsibility to hear. Actually, there is something in there for everybody, literally, even if they're not really particularly interested in the subject. So,
Yeah.
and that actually leads us nicely, I think, into fear.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people fear hearing what other people are saying.
Okay. Could you expand on your perspective on that?
So, in the last sort of few years or so, we've been hearing what politicians and global organisations have been saying. So the slight part that you missed out at the end was about the tyranny and how fear can be used for tyranny. And so one thing my eyes have been opened even further to is the fear that's created by what people are saying who are in authority, who people have maybe not 100% trusted, but trusted enough for them to do what they're told. But that's often done through fear, because they're listening to the words of these people who are a prime minister or a scientist of esteem who's qualified and has been 30 years experience, and so they're kind of believing what they're saying. But actually, when you break it down, they're then acting on what these people are saying out of fear a lot of the time. And so then this creates a whole huge chain reaction of events for that individual and at population levels. So it's interesting when people do speak and they don't always agree with something, but they'll carry on through fear, not just of the specific words that have been said, but also fear of not conforming to what everybody else is going to do, like speed limits on the road. And there's arguments from various parties as to whether speed limits should be lowered or they should be kept the same, and in some instances people want them to be higher. But people will often act out of fear of not abiding to the speed limit because you've got other people driving faster. So they want to conform to what everybody else is doing, so they actually don't do what is the highest good, a phrase that I've come into recently, for themselves and for others, because of fear of not conforming and not wanting to stand out from the majority.
Do you think that it's just fear, or could it also be something like a lack of education or a lack of insight?
I don't think it's lack of education, because I think innately we have an understanding of what is good and what is not good. I think we are born with this innate sensation, I guess, or sort of something from within us that feels not quite right.
Like a moral code, like
Yeah,
internally?
yeah.
Okay.
And so when people, I guess the education side of it also creates fear, because sometimes too much knowledge of a thing can also create fear. I think that when we bombard ourselves and fill our headspace with stuff, we're not always listening to what's in here.
Mm-hmm.
And so we kind of get lost, I think. And then, you know, the lack of education, I think there's almost a naivety at times with a lack of education. And what is education in itself? It's not really about schooling or scholarliness, you know, people who've got degrees or, you know, doctorates, etc. That's just about, you know, getting more information in. That's not necessarily education. And it's not, I sort of see the world now as a middling educated person in the scholarly sense, that actually people who have you know, got multiple qualifications of what I decree to be the highest order, they're not actually very clever.
So you're obviously referring to intellectual education there. So what kind of education are you saying that people maybe, I don't want to use the word lacking, but could use more of?
I think certainly from a morality point of view, and looking within themselves, I think I've been far too guilty of it throughout my life, of making decisions from my head. And even, I think, people pleasing as well. I think a lot of, certainly from and this kind of, it's a slight side arc, but into polarity and the masculine and the feminine, and where the masculine is kind of wants to serve. And so we kind of channel away from actually our innateness in a way because of education. So sometimes I think the people who are less sort of scholarly actually have a bit of an advantage in some ways, that they are less influenced, and yet they can still learn about, they can still, you know, absorb information, they can listen to what people are saying. And I think maybe they are less influenced by being more scholarly, you know, more intellectual, if you like, in a lot of ways. And I think that's why a lot of the, if you like, the working classes, the lower classes, you know, if you look at it from a certain perspective, are much harder to influence in many ways, but also in some other ways they are easier to influence, both at the same time. It really kind of depends on what it is and what their own personal situation is and what their own fears and where that stems from.
Because I'm interested in what you're saying about the working class and people that are a little bit more educated, how they can be influenced in different ways. And so when I look at the working class and, you know, the lower class of society, that I see people, my experience of not only working but coming from that background to myself, so seeing it from different perspectives, is that the people have, it may be more emotionally influenced by events that are happening outside of themselves, but I think being able to stand in their authenticity and who they are and stand for what they believe in, rather than being swayed by, I don't know, things that are things elsewhere in different classes. So I don't know, the wanting to be something else, or the desire to, you know, extend themselves intellectually in this way, or to move into this area in their profession. So what I'm interested is how you think they can be influenced in different ways, and what you perceive that to be.
I think the greatest influence, and it's ruled by fear. A lot of people, vast swathes of the population, in this country at least, are in survival mode. We see food banks by the tens of thousands. people struggling financially, and they're so much in survival mode just from, putting food on the table for themselves and their children, or at this time of year, heating and energy. That fear alone stops them from developing.
Mm-hmm.
It stops their development to want to learn, because their energies, their focus is so much on where is my next loaf of bread coming from.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought that up. Yeah.
And also, I think because the Western society particularly has been sold a lifestyle of toys, of the internet, of mobile phones, of gaming, that actually people's focus on where their resources go to is being diluted massively. I know somebody who I've sort of helped out recently, and their fear of not having any money because of their personal situation that cropped up, and yet they were talking about, I haven't got Wi-Fi, I haven't got enough money to pay for my phone, I haven't got a TV for the kids. And I'm thinking, well, those are three things that from my perspective at least, that these three things are something that you shouldn't even be talking about yet. You need to be, and it's a judgment, and it's probably an unfair judgment, but I guess from my perspective it's like, well, you can actually live without those things really easily at some point, maybe not so easily to start with, but actually those things where you're spending £60 a month on those things or more, that £60 can put food on your table, but now they're kind of just in survival mode, and they can't develop and learn that actually it's not their fault that they're in that situation. Absolutely it's not, because there's enough for everybody. There's enough for every single person on the planet. People who say there's too many people on the planet, it's complete rubbish. Complete rubbish. There's enough resources for everybody. It's just that it's so unevenly distributed, or not even distributed at all. And yet, this fear actually restricts these people, a lot of people, from just developing on. And it happens at all levels, I think, as well, apart from the ruling classes, really.
So, my perspective on that is, so people who are perhaps in those situations, there's got to be a level of conditioning from when they've grown up, their personal life circumstances, which have obviously brought them to the place where they're at. And so all of these things, especially, what's your education level? What's your experience at school? How do you look after your health? And what's in your environment? Is your environment a healthy place for you to really improve and live a fulfilling life? And then you've just got these personal circumstances that compound over the years. So, trying to put myself in their shoes, for example, yes, I know that you say that is it a priority? And, objectively, I can look at a situation, and even when I'm helping people, I can look, okay, well, you're telling me that this is your situation, but what is actually a priority? Let's evaluate all of this. But if you're in that situation, then I can only imagine that you're trying to look out for your kids, and how do you manage your children if you're unable to manage yourself? Then you're self-soothing as well, so that would be TV and I don't know, maybe drugs or alcohol or any other coping mechanisms that people have. And then you may find yourself in the situation where yes, that £60 could have gone towards food, but then in that moment, if you're unable to manage just what is happening, and it's almost like everything is coming down on you, then it's like, okay, well, we have food in the cupboards, maybe we have a few tins, or maybe we have some pasta that, the kids are fed, and even if mum and dad need to go hungry, whatever the situation is. But if we can put the TV on, if we can pay for the Wi-Fi, if we can access our phones, and maybe again that self-soothing and scrolling and just living life online, then that is an easier, I want to say, an easier escape is into another world and into moving yourself away from your circumstances because of the inability to manage them effectively.
But doesn't that just keep cycling around
Yeah,
and around
it
and
does.
around, and then there's no chance of escaping that fear, that cycle of fear, and then using your resources in a particular way, and you'll for vast swathes of people, they'll never escape that.
Yeah.
They'll never escape that, and there's no intervention that really the government wants to do anything. They want people to live in fear, because people who live in fear are far more easily controllable, because they are, once you then tell them there's say a health emergency, because all they focus on is surviving, they'll then literally jump to what a government will say, somebody in authority will say. You even look at it in a car park, somebody with a high-vis jacket walking around, and people defer their authority to that person. You don't know that person from Adam.
Yeah.
So, oh yeah, it's £5 to park, you give them a fiver, and he could just walk off. And it's been known that people like, oh, I better give this person, I better give this person some money to park, otherwise I'll get a parking ticket. And yet you don't even know if that person works there.
That's a good point. Yeah.
We defer our responsibilities and our own ability to make decisions, because we are conditioned from a very young age to obey authority, to oh, well, if you don't do this, then this will happen, and that's fear-based. It's like even crossing the road as a child. For me it was the Green Cross Code. The guy who actually was the chap inside the Darth Vader outfit, he actually did the Green Cross Code adverts in the 1970s. In the 1970s, but it was the fear of getting knocked down.
I see. Okay.
So it was like, children, make sure you look and listen before you cross the road, and so there was that fear put in, because who wanted to get knocked over?
Yeah.
And actually, what should have been happening is, we should create fear for the motorist, who is the big threat to children in those situations of crossing the road. But you can control a bigger population by saying, right, okay, how can we make these people obey what we want them to do? Because actually we can get more taxes from people driving and using fuel, and we can extract more fines so we'll make driving really easy, and we'll create fear for these other groups, and we can control them really easy, because who wants, if we say, right, you could die if you don't do this, and people are going to go, oh, actually, do you know what, I'm absolutely going to do this, what I'm being told now, because I could die, or I could be severely injured.
Do you not think that could be a selection of the population rather than the population as a whole?
I think it affects, because of each individual's circumstances, it affects them in more or less amounts. So, for instance, you could have somebody who lives in a village with a dead-end road. There's no road through the village. So the likelihood in that situation of a child possibly looking, they might have already been accustomed to that situation of just walking across the road, because there's hardly any traffic. But then you go into a big city or big town, and the urban environment nowadays, at least since the early 80s, the amount of motor vehicles on the road is just, it's like a rat infestation. And yet, so people in the city are affected far more so of that kind of fear-based control than those who are in the countryside, who are, maybe away from that environment. There's a much nicer feeling in terms of your upbringing as well. There's a more perceived freedoms of being able to, go about with abandon, with, just being free. Whereas kids in a city, in an urban environment, you end up with more social problems. You end up with people feeling irate because they're in survival mode when they're driving. So people are much more aware of, right, I can't even cross the road at this moment because I fear getting knocked over because of the speed of the vehicles. Just even simple things like that. That huge difference of a personal circumstance of where just geographically where you live, never mind your upbringing. There's so many facets to fear and how people can be affected in different ways.
Do you not think that could be a generalisation of perhaps this area? I mean, we're in Hertfordshire and we're not far from London, so do you think there could be a generalisation? Because I'm also thinking about, yes, that there's different areas of the UK, but also there's different areas of the world. So are we blanketing the statement that you're making for, across the globe, or is it just geographically in this area?
I think there are so many nuances as to how fear affects people, and I think it's difficult to understand for other parts of the world as to how fear affects their lives. What is a survival situation for us in the UK could be for somebody in India. It's like, well, I can't even grasp how that's a problem for you, because their upbringing, their environment is vastly different to ours. It could be something completely that we don't even grasp because the differences in culture, and particularly environments. I get, in India, it's, but a lot of places it's very, very hot. So all the time they're thinking about heat, the fear of how hot it is, can they access water? I think the vast majority of people in the UK don't ever have a fear of not accessing water.
Again, do you think that could be a generalisation though, to say that because people who live in India have a fear of accessing water just because it's hot, and that if you live in the UK that might be less of a problem, because there are many people in the UK that are homeless and don't have access to water, so that could be a huge priority for them. And whereas, again, there could be most places in India where they're able to just access water and nutrition freely.
Yeah. Oh, I think it is so variable. I mean, and India itself is such a vast country of different environments. There's mountainous regions which are, there's places that are extremely dry, some that are quite, cold. So in some ways there are kind of temperate climates within India simply because of its vastness. And yes, I think there's just so many levels of what can affect us as individuals on even on a daily basis, that things can change as to what then becomes more apparent to us as an individual. But then when we are told by people in authority that this is something you need to worry about and concern yourself about, so when everybody's being told, whether that's through word of mouth, whether that's through social media, radio or television, however that's transmitted, it then applies to much greater number of people, where something of a serious level is being literally told to you, right, this is a problem. And so when that fear is created, people often change what they do, what they would do innately, to that, going back to that difference, the difference between right and wrong, if you like, or good and bad. And people change because of that fear. And so, if you live it's the good point about homelessness, of most people who are homeless end up in a survival mode probably before they become homeless, far in advance of becoming, not having shelter. And then they have another set of problems once they're kind of ejected from their home, or they decided they can't live in the house that they're in for whatever reason that happens. But then they have another set of problems and living in fear, and their survival mode is kind of at the extreme end in some ways. And so, people often you see in places where there's huge amounts of crime.
Mm.
Most of the crime is because people are living in fear, because they don't have what they perceive will resource them. So they do extreme things because they're in survival mode. You become a part of a gang at a young age. You get told what to do because you're in fear of repercussions of not doing what you're told to do. So then you become a criminal at 14, for instance. It's, as quite prevalent these days in big cities, that when young kids become part of a group that are committing crimes to get money, and that's their resources, they want to get money, and then a kid will join that group because they feel a sense of belonging, even though there's so many other downsides to being part of a criminal gang. But they've been in fear of, and maybe just abandoned by their parents or by relatives or their teachers, and they'll make fear-based decisions. Okay, this at the moment, joining this gang and being told to do whatever it is they're being told to, it might be, right, you need to take this parcel to such and such a place, and it could have drugs in it, or a gun in it, or something that is part of what this particular gang does. And that kid will do that thing because they're in survival mode. They can no longer, they might innately still see that that's wrong, but they see that wrong as being a better option than what they've had before. And often people are making decisions simply based on fear, and they're not making a decision that is developing for them because they just can't. They just can't make those decisions. I think that applies to a lot of us. If we all were experienced being homeless, I think living in a comfortable environment, and you are without shelter, without food and water for 24 hours, all of a sudden you're in fear, you're in survival mode, and you will start to think about doing things that you wouldn't ordinarily consider.
So, just based on, just off the back of what you said, I've been homeless myself several times, and I have slept on the streets, and I have gone days without water, I've gone over a week without food, and for me, as you mentioned earlier actually, that survival mode, for me personally it started before, but at that time I was so unconscious of my decision making and my circumstances and the effects that the actions I was taking were having on my life as a whole, which then over time, going back to how it all compounded, and I ended up in situations several times over several years. And so somebody else who could be in a situation that even, whether they're engaging in crime or if they're or if they're homeless or they're experiencing dependencies, whatever it is, that at those times there is a level of unconscious in the situation, and if they are conscious of the situation, sometimes people may not have the best tools to support them in getting out. Which kind of leads me on to the next thing that I wanted to speak to you about was, okay, so if there is this fear that resides in people, then what would you consider to be a solution to support people in making the changes to change their life effectively?
I think we need, not need, but we could just show them love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That actually, somebody cares for them. And you're not necessarily going to get any instantaneous response or change from that. But if somebody can feel supported, that they feel trust, that their fear is reduced because somebody is saying that I can't understand your situation because I'm not you. I'm not in your situation. I don't understand what's going on for you. I can only try to show you compassion and empathy. And through that, if you can resource somebody with that love, with that empathy, then maybe that can help them on their journey to move forward from where they are. And I think everybody has that within us. I think that's an innate part of being a human being. I can't speak for other species because I'm not a cat. Not yet, anyway. And
not yet.
I'm going for cat because I think, actually, I think I'll be a cat. If I'm going to come back, I'll be a cat. It's like, that's blinding.
What colour would you be though?
Oh, it's got to be black.
Oh, okay.
It's got to be a black cat.
Okay, yeah.
Because, cats is like, cats just boss the whole world, really. So I'm coming back as a cat. Anyway, sorry, slight diversion. I forgot where I was now. Yes. So we have that innate capability to love, to and empathy for other human beings. And I think if we are able to hold someone's hand, to just embrace them and just show them it's okay to be afraid. That will come up for all of us at some point or another, and just to be there for that person, whether it's to listen to them, to just be empathetic with them. And you can't really truly understand what's going on for that person. You haven't been in their shoes. You can get an inkling of what might have happened or how that might feel, because you might have similarities in your own life, but you're never going to experience what that individual person has, and the traumas that they've had that influence how they are at that moment in time. So I think if we can all show more empathy and more love for our fellow human beings, then the world would definitely be a better place. There would be few people living in fear, feeling supported such that they can then maybe make a decision that helps them in whatever situation they happen to be in, and to, if they're feeling less fear and supported and not abandoned, then they're more likely to be a bit more conscious of what they're doing is not helping their situation.
Yeah.
But it's not just, what they're doing, it's what the state often does that creates the problems in the first place, creates the trauma at childhood, because parents are living in survival mode, and then the children experience trauma, and then it becomes generational trauma where those children end up having children, and their traumas from their parents follow through them often as not through to their own children. So you get generational trauma that occurs as well, and then that begets fear, and it becomes a cycle. And I think only recently that I've started to touch upon this childhood trauma, and how that we push those things aside such that we're not consciously aware of them, but they come out in the way that we behave, whether to our own children or in relationships, or whether that's in a work environment or a social setting, or driving the car to work, and we're kind of have a fear of being late for work, so we drive like a complete idiot, and we put other people's lives at risk because we're 3 minutes late again, because of that fear. Right, my boss is going to chide me again, he's going to tell I could lose my job. So, and then you end up making a decision because you're in fear and survival mode, and so you drive like a complete lunatic. And then that one time, that situation, and somebody's going too fast, they're not looking properly because they're living in fear, or, they're in this fear state, and then somebody else gets hurt, or worse. And then everything then just implodes really badly, and that can be a situation that sets off a chain of events where that person could end up being homeless. You know, they lose their job because they can't drive anymore because they've been banned from driving because they've been, you know, the police has got involved. Their partner was, you know, if they're with somebody, they just say, oh, I can't believe you've done that, I can't be around you, and all of a sudden you're without your partner. If you've got children, your children are then looking at you in a different way. And then all of a sudden, you know, you've got no job, you're living in fear and survival mode, and then all of a sudden, 6 months, 12 months, a year, 2 years down the road, you're on the street because you didn't have that support, you didn't have somebody showing empathy for you in a situation where most people are going to be finger pointing and saying, oh, what a cunt you were. You drove like that and you've just gone and killed somebody, you know, even worse if it feels worse if it's a child, you know, or an older person. And so life can change so rapidly because of fear. And yet then when you're in that situation, it's like, right, how can we support, how can we help people in those situations? And what seems like the most heinous of circumstances as to why those events unfolded. And it might say, oh, you're just being a leftist, you know, liberalist kind of, oh, you're just, you know, showing sympathy for somebody who's killed a child. How can you give them love and empathy? And that in itself there's fear in that as to why we don't, because other people are judging us, because other people are also living in fear. And they think, well, nobody should show sympathy, you know, empathy or love to a murderer. But it's like, but why did that person end up committing that most heinous of crimes? Why did they take another human being's life? And you look back at the chain of stuff that's happened to them. And sometimes there are very sort of rare circumstances where it's a complete rush of blood at that moment, but that's a trigger response to something else that's happened. And so they go in a fear state, and then they literally tip over the edge because they've been in survival mode in other parts of their life, you know.
And I think, it's not, you know, I perceive that it's not condoning the actions or the crime or, you know, anything that somebody's done which is of the detriment to either themselves or other people. But also having that awareness that we are human, and people's life events can steer them in a direction which results in things happening. And again, it's not to condone anything that somebody does, which is you know, quote unquote bad, but for me it's one of my own practices to what's underneath all of that. Where's the root? Which again, it's trying to look in the psyche and trying to pinpoint what is happening internally and how is that manifesting externally. If that's fear, then why is that fear there? And how is that fear being actioned, or how is it being covered up? And if it's being covered up, then what actions is it being covered up with? And then just trying to remove all of those layers. And we all have those layers. And I suppose it brings it back to what can be done in day-to-day life to bring about changes in ourselves, because firstly the change has to start internally with ourselves, to then inspire, advocate and support other people in their journey of transforming that inner self to then get to a space where they can live a non-fearful life.
Something again that I've come across recently is about loving ourselves, not being as judgmental or what's the phrase? I've forgotten the phrase now. Having a superego attack, where we attack ourselves because we think we should have done better somehow in a particular situation. And so if we can kind of love ourselves, you know, kind of have some peace for ourselves, and not to try and extract ourselves from fear of a repercussion of what somebody might say or think about us, to not get that sense of trepidation because you've done a thing, and that actually other people need to accept that we, as you said, we are human, we are inherently kind of flawed in many ways, and lots of those flaws are induced into us because of our environment and because of certainly from my belief system of how we are controlled by ruling classes, that they, that creation of these fears that we have is because it's easier to rule people in that state, and and that they do want to lower our frequency, our ability to make good decisions for ourselves, to feel love and empathy for others. I think all those, a lot of the decisions that are being made at a global level are affecting people. But yeah, I think as you said before we started, recording, it comes from within us. But then that's not always so easy to find that from within ourselves, because we aren't always as resourced.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point to end on as well, that if you can tap into those inner resources, which can be difficult for some people and a little bit easier for other people, my belief system being especially about our own energetic design and how that manifests in physical form, and how able you are to go on that journey of spiritual transformation, or to make the changes and to go with the ebbs and flows of life, and to try and listen to your intuition, which is a whole life's journey. But if you can begin to practice and actualize these things, then over time you're going to be cultivating more of that inner awareness, and then when you're creating that space for yourself inside, then you can create almost like I want to say like a separation, I suppose, but you're like an observation of the mind and what's going on in the mind, and then be able to retract some of the shit that's in there, or the crap that's being pushed down, to then support you in making the changes, the conscious changes, to then creating a life which is more fulfilling and more in touch with who you are rather than who you've been conditioned to be.
Nice. I've really enjoyed this.
Good, I'm glad. I'm really, really grateful to have you on the podcast. And do you have any closing thoughts for any of the listeners?
I think love yourself, a phrase I've come to fairly recently, and don't be afraid. Everything will be okay. It will work out. And we all have fears, and yet we can change that. And then once we change to how we feel about the world, about ourselves, then actually a lot of the things that we perceive as being problems they will correct themselves. So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to having you on the podcast again at some point.
Lovely, thank you very much.
And I'll